We Now we are starting. Now, hello and welcome to the ET Telecom Google Hangout series. Today with us is well-known industry face Mr. Rajan Matthew. He is also the Director General of Cellular Operator Association of India, and Mr. Deepak Kumar, who is the founder and analyst of Business and Market, a Bangalore-based research and advisory firm. The topic for today's discussion is EMF radiation. The discussion will be around what are the things that can be done to dispel consumers' fears, and also that could stimulate industry for network expansion. Does the adoption of next-gen mobile broadband technology really help? Now over to you, Deepak.
Yeah, thanks, Muntazir. So, this topic of EMF radiation has had the industry and consumer groups very bitterly kind of pitted against each other from time to time. And for the industry, achieving low radiation level means that telcos need to deploy more and more towers, which in turn means that there is an increased amount of capex for them. For consumers, the exposure to high radiation often implies that there is a potentially increased risk to their health, right? So now the answer probably lies in determining a safe radiation limit and agreeing to those. So all the parties should be agreeing to those limits. The contentious part of it is that what actually determines a safe level of radiation. Now, as we know, the Department of Telecom has set radiation limits which are understood to be among the strictest globally, but still the issue has refused to die completely. Now, at the same time, what is happening is most of these discussions in the past have pertained to a voice era. And now, as Muntazir just pointed out, we are now moving from a voice-led era to a mobile broadband era. So the question is, will the parameters of EMF remain the same as they were in the previous era, or are they going to undergo major changes? Has the industry started working in that direction? What are the steps that would be important? So these are some of the questions that actually came up when we started deliberating on the topic with ET Telecom editors. So during the discussion, we agreed that it is probably time to take up the EMF radiation issue afresh in the wake of the 4G and 3G of course is there, and 4G LTE is coming up. So in view of these new networks and new technologies and new services coming up, we need to think afresh about the issue. So for example, in case of 4G LTE, it could become easier to deploy such form factor antennas that can be roof mounted or even used as in-building solutions. Now, what that means that these antennas would inherently, by the nature of their construction, will have lower limits of radiation, lower levels of radiation. Also, the users will probably get a choice to determine which kind of equipment they want to deploy in their premise, right, which will be suitable for them or their employees. So numerous possibilities could be explored to make adoption of such solutions a trend. And of course, awareness on the existing norms could continue to be a priority as far as the short and medium term is concerned. So that is where industry bodies like COI have an acutely proactive role to play. So they could develop a roadmap to further refine the radiation norms and implement and suggest those as measures for the industry and also probably to the regulator. Maybe they are already doing something on that front, or even are thinking of a blueprint to be set up. So we thought it is probably very appropriate to reach out to Mr. Rajan Matthews, Director General of COI, to get some first-hand view of what's happening in the industry on that front. So with that, I'll hand over to Mr. Matthews. Thank
you. Deepak, thank you first of all, and thank you for the Google Hangout session. It's a very important topic because whatever is of concern to our citizens and customers is also of importance to us in the industry. So let me just make a few clarificatory remarks and then get to the particulars. So the first point that I'd like to make is that everything that we experience in life, all the way from medicine to water to air, to whatever it is that we interact with, all have risk associated with the use. Every medicine that we take, no matter how beneficial it is, has a risk. Water, if you drink too much, has a risk to it. Air, if you breathe in polluted air, has a risk. So every aspect of our life has a risk associated with it. When you drive a car, the emissions from that car obviously has a risk to your health. So the point that we are discussing is what is the safety factor that needs to be applicable in the situation of emissions from the antenna on radio cell towers and from the handsets. So the real question is, how safe is safe? So that's the first point that I'd like to make, is that what is the appropriate safety norm, because everything has a risk and we just have to understand what is the level at which we believe it's safe to be exposed to the emissions. The second point that we have to ask is that since there are multiple voices in the issue of what is an appropriate safety factor, we have to ask the question, who is best situated to determine the appropriate safety level from all the competing claims that one hears? And it is our perspective, and I think the perspective just about worldwide, is that governments are best situated to make a decision among the competing voices as to what is the appropriate safety level that their citizens ought to be exposed to. That's the second point. The third point that we would like to highlight is that when governments decide how to listen to competing voices on safety norms, they invariably go to scientific factors and credible institutions to determine how they ought to decide on safety factors. So if you follow that through, the government of India, along with just about every government in the world, has determined that WHO, the World Health Organization, is the most credible and appropriate body to refer to in terms of determining what is the appropriate safety factor. The WHO has a specific organization underneath it called ICNIRP. It's the International Commission for non-ionizing radiation protection. It specifically deals with how to test for the safety factor. So the government of India in 2008 decided to adopt the ICNIRP safety factor. 2011, because of the increasing concern that was being expressed by the citizens of India, formed an interministerial committee, and based on the feedback of the interministerial committee, without any scientific backing but for caution and safety, further decided to reduce it from the ICNIRP WHO level by a factor of 90%, almost 1/10 reduction. So today, as you pointed out, Indian citizens face safety factors that are well below the norms adopted by 90% of the people of the world. So I think that goes to the situation of saying the citizens of India ought to feel very comfortable with the government decision in terms of adopting safety norms which they have based on scientifically observed factors and on institutions that are the most credible to be able to answer the question, how safe is safe? So that is the 3 points that I would like to preliminarily put to you, Deepak, in terms of how we ought to be able to look at this situation and address the issue of EMF.
So, Mr. Matthews, that's a very important point that you brought up, that the norms or the limits set up in India are actually 1/10 of the international limits norms. Why is it still that the issue kind of refuses to die up? And in the past, in fact, we have seen even some celebrities coming up and extending their support to set up even stricter norms against the tower radiation. So what is the what are the dynamics about the whole thing? Do you think there is probably a lack of awareness that is kind of causing this, or is there some other factor also which could be technological in nature?
First of all, Deepak, what we notice is that EMF is a global phenomenon. It's not just that in India we have these issues being raised. However, the significant difference between what we see in the international realm and in India is that internationally the concern has been around the use of the handset, because that is the instrument that is closest to you. Internationally, the concern has not been around cell towers. The second point that, again, to answer your question, why do we have this concern in India? Again, this concern internationally, we know, is raised by certain folks that gather together to raise this issue. They have an interest in going after lower limits, right? And very often that debate is carried on without very much substantial scientific backing. Now, just because you have a quote-unquote scientific paper supporting your point of view, the World Health Organization looks at what they call the preponderance or the weight of evidence. Not every scientific article or paper is equal to others, right? So you have to look at the credibility and the quality of the research that is being done. So in this multiple voice noise that we hear, we see this as an international phenomenon, and we see that carried through in India, where groups of people are picking up on these international voices that have raised their concern. We are addressing those concerns and trying to distinguish between fact and fiction or some myths that are circulating. Some folks we have noticed who are raising the concern seem to be doing it in order to sell equipment that they themselves are manufacturing, which supposedly improve your benefits from being shielded from radiation. We believe that those are inappropriate activities. And in the rest of the world, as in India, what we are also noticing is that when you reduce the safety norms without any scientific rationale or basis for doing so, as we have done in India and in some other parts of the world, those countries have continued to show a higher concern, not a lower concern. This is an anomaly. So countries which have stuck to the original safety norms from the WHO and have said that that is scientifically determined, that there's no necessity to reduce it further, those countries, the citizens of those countries, show much more satisfaction and less concern with the safety norms that have been adopted.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant, Mr. Matthews, because it is also, some experts have also been saying that if you kind of decrease the radiation limit too much on the tower side, then what happens? The handset kind of tries to make it up, right? So increase the frequency on the handset side tends to increase, and because the user is holding it close to his ears, so the impact is more visible, the impact is greater felt to the user. That also brings us. Actually, there are a couple of questions lined up, but since you have raised this as a very interesting and important aspect, so I am kind of drawn to ask this question further. Is could be done, because the limits have actually been set too low, which probably should have not been that low, as that's what you are suggesting as per the global norms. So is there a need to create the awareness in among the stakeholders and bring it closer to the global norms? Is that kind of...
The government of India has made the decision to reduce the norm already in the original safety norms set up by ICNIRP. There was a 50-point safety margin, 50 times below the point at which it was shown to have any impact. For safety purposes, they reduced it by a factor of 50. the Indian government, by reducing it even further, has further increased the safety margin in terms of exposure limits. So again, Deepak, to your point, when we say should we go back, the industry has already decided to go along with the government and saying that, listen, since you have decided to lower it, and if that addresses the concerns of the citizens, we as the industry are willing to go along with the government, because ultimately the government must take responsibility for setting the appropriate safety norms. So we are in full compliance with the government's norm. If the government, as a result of its own study and by reference to international standards, should decide to take it back up, we are happy to go along with that. So we are only saying that any decision should be scientifically based and not done willy-nilly, because remember, networks are global and networks are national. If you have a cell phone and if every state decides to adopt its own norm, you will have a very fractured network and you will not be able to use your cell phone across state lines the way you would like to. And similarly, internationally, you will not be able to take your phone when you visit some country that you're going to if we have differing norms. So again, we need to be careful. That's why internationally and nationally, we try to have a common standard. It's like saying is that, look, if everybody drives on the left-hand side of the road, we'd like to make sure that everybody globally drives on the left-hand side. When you go to countries that drive on the right-hand side, you have a problem. So this is why international harmonization and national harmonization is very important.
Right, right. So, Mr. Matthews, there are a couple of questions coming up. So, one question is, you know, there is also radiation happening from TVs and radios and all that. How the radiation happening in the telecom sector is very different from those sectors?
So first of all, Deepak, we need to get a fundamental point across before we answer that question. And that point is that when we talk about emissions or radiation, as we sometimes refer to it, there is a wide spectrum of emissions, right? Sunlight is a form of EMF, right? So there is what we call non-ionizing and ionizing emissions or radiation. It is the ionizing part of the radiation, things like X-rays, that are injurious to your health. The non-ionizing part of the radiation spectrum is non-injurious to your health, and by that we mean that it has no ability to impact your DNA or break down your cell structure. So therefore, things like microwave, TV, FM radio, AM radio, satellite transmission, all of that happens in the non-harmful, non-ionizing part of the spectrum. So therefore, even though TV stations and antennas radiate much higher than what we put out from a cell tower, it is still considered safe because it is in the non-ionizing part of the spectrum.
Right. So I hope that question from the audience gets answered. There's another question, Mr. Matthews, which asks, are there studies? So it is said, it is argued often by consumer groups and other parties that the cell phone, the mobile radiation causes things like cancer and stuff like that. So the question here from the audience is, are there studies, scientific studies that have kind of proven that it actually happens, or is it just based on some, yes?
The studies that we have to date, and by the way, let me please explain that this is not a new phenomenon. Radio waves have been in play since the time Marconi discovered, how to send radio waves across airwaves. So this has been going on for 100 years or more. So it's just not a cellular mobile phenomenon. Before this, the army was using it, military forces were using it, TV stations were using it, FM stations were using it. So we've had a long period of exposure to EMF, right? So now, getting back to the issue that you raised, saying is that, listen, if you look at the handset side of the equation. Clearly, yes, the handset side, as you pointed out, is the point that is closest to your body, and so therefore needs to be utilized, and looked at much more carefully than you would say from a cell tower emission factor. So the cell tower is much further away, all right, and the safety norms are a fraction of what is being put out by a TV star. So one should not be as concerned at all from any of these emission standards right now.
Okay, thank you. Um, there's another question which says, how come there are so many towers, at every nook and corner visible in India, and there are not so many of these towers visible in countries like in the European countries, for example? Why is it so?
So
Is that something to, sorry, kind of do with this issue?
So when you look at that particular reason, three particular rationale and reasons, Deepak. For one, the number of cell towers that are necessary is highly correlated to population density and the amount of spectrum that you have. The lower the amount of spectrum that you have, the more cell towers that you will need. And the higher the population density, the more towers that you will have. So when you take those two driving factors, you will notice that population density in Europe and America and other parts of the world are not as high as in India.
Correct.
And the amount of spectrum that is being allocated to us is much, much lower. So, for example, most of the operators in Europe and in America have upwards of 50 megahertz on average. We, on the other hand, have only about 12 to 15 megahertz on average. So you can see the significant difference in the amount of spectrum we have and in the population density. If you take a city like Delhi, you have upwards of 15 million people just in Delhi. So you can imagine the amount of towers that you will need to carry that demand. Please remember, no operator ever puts up a cell tower if there is no demand. All right, so the reason we put up a cell tower is because the citizens are demanding that they need to use it. And so it's in response to the demand from citizens that we put up cell towers, and we need to put up more cell towers, again, because of the amount of people that live in close proximity and the shortage of spec we have.
So, yeah, I would agree, because no operator would like to invest more unnecessarily putting up towers. That also brings us to a related question from another audience. Which kind of dwells upon the mobile broadband aspect also. So in India now we have 1800 megahertz also available for 4G LTE services and all. But initially a lot of 2300 megahertz frequencies were allocated for BWA spectrum. So now, does this higher restrictor radiation norms will it impact the expansion of 4G LTE services, especially in the 2300 megahertz band?
So, Deepak, very definitely so, and already some portions of Europe are experiencing the negative impact of having set too low a safety norm. And specifically, we know that this is happening in Brussels, for example, in the Netherlands, and in some sections of Austria, Salzburg, for example, which have adopted a safety level much lower than what their overall state has. So Salzburg is in Austria. Austria follows ICNIRP, but Salzburg has decided to go at a lower level. Same thing in Belgium. Belgium follows ICNIRP, but Brussels, one of the cities, has decided to adopt a lower level. In all of these instances, we are finding that these cities cannot roll out 3G and 4G. And why is that? As you go higher and higher in the spectrum band, that is 2100, 2300, which is the spectrum we use for broadband services, you need to use greater power because you need to push those out further. That's just physics. And if you have an artificially low safety norm, you will not be able to push out the signals the way you need to in 3G, 4G. So even as we speak, both Brussels and the Austrian situation, Salzburg, the city there, are looking at raising back that level because they find that they are falling behind in the rest of their neighbors in terms of having access to broadband services.
Right. Mr. Matthews, what is also would be your take on in the context of 4G technologies that are coming up now, and we will see in 2014 and 15 a lot of these networks getting rolled out. So we touched upon the aspect that the form factor of the antennas in these technologies will become smaller and can become smaller and could be used as in building solutions and all. So do you think that it is in that kind of a scenario, a lot of onus also comes to the users organizations, especially the large users of the telecom services, right? And not just kind of put everything for the industry to handle, but make it more as a collective responsibility. So what kind of trends do you see happening on that front?
So Deepak, just one point of reference, and then I'll answer the question as you put it. First of all, please remember that just because a cell tower or a cell antenna, the form factor gets smaller, it usually also means that the capacity of that cell tower is also reduced. And so therefore, what happens is that the coverage area for that cell gets diminished. So you have this odd situation of while you reduce the size, you will have to put up more smaller ones to get the same type of coverage that you're looking for, right? So at the end of the day, you're really not doing yourself much of a favor by going to a smaller footprint, if you will, or a smaller form factor, as you put it. So when you go inside a building, or what we have, a small femtocell or a microcell or whatever, all right, the exposure limits that we apply still are the safety norms. So whether you have a small cell or a large cell, the only thing that ultimately is going to be a differential is the aesthetics. Yes, small towers or small form factors are less obtrusive, are less, if you want to call it, ugly. The larger ones tend to be more, in your face, if you will, and so therefore there's that scare factor. But at the end of the day, whether they are small or whether they are large, the concern that we have is the amount of emissions from those antennas. And all of those antennas must cumulatively make sure that they have the safety norm that is mandated by the government. So that's the important thing that one needs to bear in mind.
Right, very much agreed to that. So essentially what you are saying, in a way, you are also putting the onus back from the government, and to be fair to that, and definitely because we also discussed that the radiation is not just a function of one thing, but it's a very complex issue. There are a lot of aspects involved. So the form factor is there, the distance is there involved, right? The height of the tower is involved, and the amount of, if you reduce the radiation limit too much, reduce the radiation too much, then it kind of it starts impacting, hurting the user on who is holding the handset, right? So the challenge is probably, as you are pointing out, is to determine a sweet spot of frequencies which can be sustainable in the long run, which can also support the multitude of frequencies that we are now witnessing. So we are already in a HETNET kind of an environment, right? So it should kind of be, there is more thought that needs to go into determining the radiation levels, and if required, the stakeholders, the regulators, the policymakers, along with the industry, probably need to revisit the norms that have been set up and make it more in line with the global norms and make them more useful, and also that would probably help reduce the uh, hazard health hazard concerns that keep coming up. So with that, I'll hand over to Muntazir to kind of conclude this session. And if there are any other questions or any other points that you would like to bring up.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Matthews and Mr. Deepak, for engaging with us. We would like to hear more from you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.